happy to answer questions. I have written testimony, of course, that has details for all of this.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your testimony. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to enter into a record, into the record, a letter from SpaceX. So without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony, very valuable, and we really appreciate you folks coming to this morning. And the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. And Mr. Cavosa, China is racing to land humans on the moon before us and is on track to do so by 2030. Can you speak to how red tape is impacting commercial space operators and more broadly progress towards American goals for space exploration?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. I think there was a few things you said in your opening remarks that I wrote down that made a lot of sense to me. It was this concept of a red moon and red tape, and that's stuck in my head because that's something that we're concerned about. We're concerned that the licensing process right now, the implementation and management of the licensing process is creating drag on the industry and its innovation. Anything that we need to put in space today, whether it's a national security, a civil space mission, human spaceflight mission, remote sensing, all has to be launched on one of our member companies' rockets. And we're slowing that process down, whereas the Chinese are very much focused on enabling their industry to move as quickly as possible without regard for safety. We don't want to throw out public safety. We are very happy with the public safety record of this industry to date. We want to make sure that the implementation of 450 doesn't continue to slow this industry's innovation down. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, outside of FAA, other entities within the federal government have expertise in space operations, including NASA and Department of Defense. How is FAA leveraging existing practices of other agencies or operations which have already been reviewed and approved by another government agency so we can expedite application processing?
Chair Babin, thank you for the question. We will certainly accept analyses and work that has been done by other federal agencies if those analyses and that work meets our requirements. We allow launch service providers who are conducting launches from the federal ranges to leverage the ranges services to conduct those analyses. And so as long as those analyses meet our regulatory requirements, we will absolutely accept those analyses. Now, there are some circumstances in which the federal ranges are working in sort of different capacities with companies. For example, the Space Force 45 is working with SpaceX at Boca Chica in a different capacity than it does for launches that take place from the range itself. They're working in more of a contractor capacity with the launch service provider, and which is a little bit different than the way they work when the launch is occurring from the federal range itself.
Thank you. And also, to follow up, you state in your testimony, Mr. Coleman, that over the last 11 years, FAA has issued 49 license determinations, averaging 151 days to issue a new license. Does that 151 days include time spent in the pre-application process before FAA accepts the application as complete enough? From the testimony I've heard, I think I know the answer, but please.
Yeah, the 150 days is the time that it takes from the clock starting to the determination being made. I will mention on the pre-application consultation, I think there's a little bit of a misconception about what pre-application consultation is and what constitutes pre-application consultation. In simple terms, it is a conversation between the regulator and the launch service provider where we exchange, from the launch service provider's standpoint, what the concept of operations is, what their operations are, where would they occur, et cetera. We share what the regulations require, what we're looking for in terms of compliance, et cetera. Once the applicant provides an application to us, we're no longer in pre-application consultation. We are in a period where we are now assessing whether that application is acceptable or not. Under Part 450, applicants are required to provide means of compliance. This is work that they have to do to show us how they will comply.
Well, if the average time for a new license, what is the average time for a new license if you account for this pre-application process?
Well, I don't have that information and data to account for pre-application consultation, but 151 days is the average time it takes us to conduct a determination.
But that
for
does
the
not
license.
include the pre-application process. Okay, Ms. Meredith, I have one more question here. This committee passed the Commercial Space Act last November to ensure continued compliance with our international obligations in the least burdensome way possible. At the same time, the administration proposed an approach that would grant several agencies broad and sweeping authority to not only maintain treaty compliance, but also to regulate anything in the national interest, quote unquote, which they alone would determine. Can you comment on how the administration's proposal would affect international competitiveness as well as our nation's ability to explore space?
Yeah. I hadn't specifically looked at the administration's proposal for this, but I think a general complaint with that sort of legislation is that, or proposed legislation, is that it's overbroad and difficult to pass because it is overbroad. So I think that's one of the concerns with that legislation. Also, bifurcating the licensing authority may not be the best approach. That was another thought I had about that legislation, or proposed legislation. Yeah.
My time's expired, so I'm going to go to the ranking member, Mr. Sorensen.